This week, in a very special episode of The Jews Are Tired, all three of Jewfolk Inc.'s podcasters get together for an interview with Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. We asked the governor a wide-ranging set of questions from schmaltzy to serious to hear his thoughts on the tumultuous moment we live in. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. Now, I'm not going to get in your way with a bunch of background here, but just to fill out the details of the who, what, and why before the interview itself, as part of a mega 24-hour Jewfolk Inc. event called Cation, meant to be a stay-at-home virtual vacation experience for all the cooped-up Jews out there, the good people at Jewfolk Inc. decided to reach out to the governor's office and see if he'd be willing to record a podcast with us as part of the event. Clearly, he said yes, for which we're very grateful. So, Lonnie Goldsmith, editor of TC Jewfolk and showrunner of the Who the Folk podcast, Sarah Bogomolny, the showrunner of the Leader Folk podcast, and myself from The Jews Are Tired, tag-teamed this interview with Governor Walz. Cation is also Jewfolk Inc.'s big fundraiser of the year, so if you are a fan of this podcast or any other Jewfolk content, there's a link in the podcast notes if you'd like to support us with a donation. This interview has been lightly edited for length and clarity. Enjoy. So let's just sort of start in with an introductory question. We all know you as the governor of Minnesota, of course, but could you go back a little and tell us, what's your background with the Jewish community of Minnesota? Do you have any particularly fond memories of our community or anything that has surprised you at any point?
Well, again, thank you for having me on here. And of course, the Jewish community of Minnesota is vibrant. It's certainly made our state, I think, the rich diversity that it provided. For me, I don't know if I grew up in a small farming community, actually in northeast Nebraska, small farm. I always graduated with 24 classmates, 12 were cousins, one of those types of communities. I grew up rural Catholic. But also, I think, was blessed by the timing of this. The priests that I had were liberation theologists coming out of that 60s and 70s movement of social justice and caring for the poor. And I think seeing that connection, and of course, as I went on and I got a teaching degree, I taught out at Pine Ridge and then went and worked in China. But I also got the opportunity to be one of the first Balfour Fellows to the Holocaust Museum. I did my master's work in genocide studies, and they took a teacher from each state, and I had that opportunity. And I think, getting that education, getting that viewpoint and spending some time, because quite honestly, in Northeast Nebraska, I never had any Jewish neighbors. And when I came to Minnesota, in southern Minnesota, the community is relatively small, but it didn't take long to find those folks who were working on social justice issues where I find myself gravitating to. And I ran my first congressional campaign. I had one staffer was Leah Solo, and Leah's over at SEIU and introduced me. And I think over time, as a member of Congress, working on social justice issues, working and getting to know, of course, leaders like, whether it be Steve Simon, Frank Hornstein, Ron Latz, others, and then just friends throughout the community. And I think for the Lieutenant Governor and I, Rabbi Zimmerman presided over our inauguration, and we were very clear in the faith leaders that were represented that day, from Rabbi Zimmerman to our Muslim friends, to the indigenous folks who were there. And over time, we've worked on a lot of, I think, common ground issues.
And I love that you mentioned Leah, so I want to say hi to Leah. She is, her and her husband, Brian, and their kids are good friends of my wife and mine, and we've known them for quite a long time. So I know
amazing people.
They're amazing people, and it's really fun because, I got to hear about you long before you were, running for governor. When you were, first district candidate, I was hearing about you from Leah. So it really is.
We traveled to China together and everything. Here's my Leah joke too. Is we're out in Fulda, and they have this big fundraiser they do, and they roast a hog underground for like 4 days, and they have it. And so it's at this fundraiser, and I'm being all, trying to be gregarious out there talking to people. And it was Leah and I didn't know how to run for Congress or whatever. And I'm like, this is such good, this pork sandwich. I said, Leah, have some. Leah's being all great. No, I'm fine, I'm full of all this. And finally, Leah stops in the middle. She said, Mr. Walz, how long have you known me? I said, like 5 years, Leah. And she said, and how long have I been Jewish? I said, that entire time. And she said, does that explain anything to you? I said, perfectly clear, perfectly clear. I'm not out here for the pork roast. But Leah was great. And, she was very close to our family, very babysit my kids. And, of course, her mother, and ironically enough, a public health nurse, of course, now in the age of COVID, all those things come back together.
No, absolutely. She's great. It's a great family. And, like I said, I've been hearing about you for a long time because of our relationship with Leah. So we're personally, excited to see you at the, being where you are as governor. But I do want to switch gears to maybe some of the serious stuff that's going on, across the state. The back in the, sort of lost track of time here in 2020. But I guess back in the late winter, early spring, I mean, you mentioned Frank Hornstein. He was one of the people instrumental in introducing a hate crimes bill that was introduced to the legislature. It was a coalition of Jewish, Muslim, Asian, LGBTQ groups that would have made it easier to collect hate crime reports, classify hate crimes, train police officers. And obviously, priorities may be shifting a little bit once now that we're in the midst of COVID and endless special sessions. But what do you think it'll take to break through some of the dysfunction that's happening right now to get a bill like this passed, which is really important to so many minority communities in the state?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Lonnie, too. And as you said, it was certainly spurred by, we saw, a rise in anti-Semitism, but as all of your listeners know, the Jewish community has been at the center of all these social justice movements. So it was far broader than that. And of course, Frank is brilliant, working with Attorney General Ellison, I might add, and Senator Latz, of bringing this forward. I think this is something that seemed needed. It's, talks everything from police training to making property crimes, a part of this, not just persons. This should have gone. But here's the problem that we saw is that we didn't even get a hearing on this bill. And I think so many times, if our democracy is functioning correctly, these hearings really matter. They're time to air this. You bring in witnesses. We're functioning. And I was proud of this, that we are the only state in the union with divided legislative bodies. 48 states have either all Democratic control or Republican control. Nebraska's a unicameral, and Minnesota, where the House is DFL and the Republican Senate. And again, I certainly have my ideology. I certainly would like to, get things the way I would like to have them done, but that's not necessarily the way it works. I guess my biggest disappointment was on things like hate crimes, common sense gun legislation, some of those types of things. We didn't even get hearings on them. So here's what I have to say. I think in the aftermath of George Floyd, we moved some things, but not enough. Again, if anti-Semitic, incidents have dropped off, they haven't dropped off. They haven't gone away. They're always there. They're going to come back. It just depends on how vigilant we are. And I think Frank put this out there for that very reason. These are tools that are used to stop an escalation in these types of hate crimes. So here's my take. I think there's a good chance we get this thing back. I think, we're going to the polls here in a few days. We're already voting as we speak. I think there'll be some changes. And I think if people think that Minnesota is going to go back just to the way it was, they're sadly mistaken. And this is needed. There's a direct line to this hate crimes legislation and what's tied in with George Floyd. So I'm hopeful.
When you talk about tools that we have in our toolbox to combat some of the hate in our world, I'd love to talk about your pre-political career as a high school social studies teacher and how that ties into another exciting thing that the state is working on right now. And some in our community might not realize that this year the state is reviewing the social studies standards, which includes Holocaust and genocide studies. So is it a priority to keep those topics in the standards and for it to be taught? And can you assure the community that future generations will continue to learn these things?
Well, thanks, Sarah. It's a great question. Don't go back and read my master's dissertation. It was on, but it was on teaching of Holocaust and genocide studies in school. And the reason I did that was all the data, and think about this is decades ago, was already pointing to our students. They could identify as a historical anomaly that something happened. And they could give you the number 6 million and they could talk about this. But what they did was they saw it as a historical anomaly in a vacuum, and they saw no connection to their own life. And our curriculums were doing that. California was first to take a stab at this, and it's some of the stuff I started looking at that got me interested in this. And it's why I applied and went to the Belfour Fellow. And here's what happened. Here's what we're trying to do in the prevention of either hate crimes or, God forbid, genocide, which we still see in the world. I had a senior class project where we were taking and doing genocide early warning signs, ethnic unrest. What we saw was propaganda and crimes increasing. And we put together a rubric, and this is in 1992, seniors in a sociology class. And this group of seniors came together, and their job was to predict, using these data points, where was the next genocide going to be? And they said Rwanda, 14 months before it happened. And it got published in the New York Times. It put out, and it's terrifying. Till to this day, it impacts these students because they ask the question, why didn't we do anything about this? And so when Minnesota has a chance to put these into our standards, we need to take this to an entirely another level, that we don't teach it in a historical vacuum of what happened. And those signs that start to come up, and it's not an overreach, and we don't want to scare our children, but there are clear-cut signals that you can start to see where these things happen. And so I hope we come back to that. I hope we tell the story. I think we're struggling with in this, we saw it after George Floyd's murder and on the Capitol grounds, the taking down of the Columbus statue. And of course, from an indigenous community that wants to have a reckoning in our social studies classes and in our schools. And again, this year, when we pardoned Max Nathan, when we had the lynching in Duluth, Minnesota students don't even know about the lynching in Duluth. They didn't know about this. So yes, your answer is spot on. And I think you're clearly moving upstream on how we prevent these things. We need hate crimes legislation in to make sure that we're able to stop this when it happens. But we've got to move back upstream before we ever get to that point. And it really starts by telling our stories and having communities tell their stories.
So then tying into sort of this bigger idea of watching out for concerning trends as they're happening, one of the big concerns in the Jewish community, and a concern I know many other people in other minority communities have right now, is about safety with the upcoming election in November. We know from personal experience and congressional testimony with heads of the FBI, the DHS, and the DOJ that over the past several years, the biggest terrorism threat in America comes from white supremacists in the country. And we know white supremacists are very active around the election right now, with just last week a plot to kidnap and do God knows what to the governor of Michigan and Virginia, to the governors of Michigan and Virginia, this plot was stopped by the FBI. And in Michigan just a few months ago, the legislature was stormed by militias with the real threat of violence. And you had the president of the United States tweeting out, quote, liberate Michigan and liberate Virginia. So when you're looking out as the governor of Minnesota at this context in the country, at these trends, in the Midwest in particular, do you worry about what's happening in those states happening here in our home?
Yes, and I think if you recall on those tweets, it was also Liberate Minnesota was one of those three, Michigan and put out. So there's no active threat, and I understand what I signed up for, and I have good people, but it's not just about the plots for elected officials. This extends down to everyone. When these folks feel like they can operate with impunity, the idea that they could stand in a state capitol with firearms, and again, it's not an issue about the Second Amendment. This is about intimidation, and the ideology that they're professing is simply the antithesis of what we believe. So I do worry about that, and we know that some of these folks had connections to here. We know some of those folks showed up at the George Floyd protests. And so we need to stay vigilant. We need to call it out where it needs to be called out. We need to make it clear there aren't good people on both sides of these things. There are people whose ideology does not conform to our values, and has no place in our society. And if it is left unchecked, it is not hyperbole to say it leads to an escalation of harassment, of violence, and much worse. So I think we need to stay vigilant. We need to stay concerned. I think in each of these states, in the upper Midwest, that these groups have a presence. But I think the good news is there's far more good people, but it's that piece about making sure that we are coordinated, we are clear, we are taking action, we are passing legislation like Representative Hortstein's hate crimes legislation, and we're simply not allowing this type of behavior to thrive because it's finding fertile ground right now. And I've said it time and time again, the language that I use has to be thoughtful and measured as an elected official, and I would expect the same of all others. So I can assure your folks who are listening and viewing that we will have safe elections. We will have fair elections where your vote will be counted. But we do take very seriously, I think you saw last week there was recruitment out of a company in Tennessee to recruit basically a private militia to watch the polls. We don't need them to watch the polls. We have safe and secure elections here under our democratic way of doing things, and we will enforce those. So Minnesota's ready, but we have to stay vigilant.
And it's interesting, Governor, that you mentioned the ads looking, for poll watchers, if you will, and there was something that Senator Klobuchar made a point of mentioning during earlier this week during the Supreme Court hearings in Washington, that type of interference, people are advertising for it, basically, people with special forces backgrounds and and the like. So it's very much, unfortunately, something that's there and part of the current consciousness.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, and our democracy is good. What we advertise for is election judges. We want young people to get involved, be nonpartisan, get out there and let people vote. We know what this is about. It's about intimidation. Whether they truly intended to hire anyone or not isn't even the point. The point is they're trying to make is it's not safe to go vote. Again, I get the temptation, and I'm certainly not without fault, but this whole there's bad people on both sides or whatever. Listen to the rhetoric. Listen to what the rhetoric's saying. Listen to who they're trying to entice to get this. Why would you need those special qualifications? And when none of that is either legal or needed. So I guess, the antidote to this is to engage in your community. The antidote is to stand up in these times. And especially now, the short-term solution is vote. That's all I can say, vote.
So, one of the, obviously, can't talk to you in 2020 and not talk about COVID, unfortunately. And a lot was made very, very early on here in Minnesota of the sort of regional response coalition with yourself, Governor Evers in Wisconsin, Governor Whitmer in Michigan, and the governors of Illinois, Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana. What's been going on with that lately? And are you still working with those or other governors in terms of addressing the pandemic locally? And has that line of communication proven useful over the course of the past 6 months?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yes, we're still there. In fact, we just spoke on Monday, I believe, several days ago. We get on, we share best practices. Our health departments work back and forth. Let's just be clear. As governors were thrust into the middle of this, and that's fine. That's what we signed up for. But there was no federal response. The president made clear early on, he said, I take no responsibility, and it's up to the governors to do this. I took that seriously and started to do what we could do. I also knew that we're not an island. We're looking like one right now because states around us have taken a different approach, and it's only a matter of time before our numbers go up. But working hand in hand with governors, whether it be on testing, whether it be on best practices, whether it be on things that they're doing in their businesses to make work, or this week we just today signed on to a letter asking for more collaboration around the testing from the federal government and working with our neighboring states on what a vaccination program is going to look like when this comes out. It's not like it's going to magically happen. You've got to store this stuff at 90 below zero. You've got to be able to track who got the shots. Many of these are going to involve 2 shots. They need to be spaced very carefully apart, however many days that is. So we're going to have to keep tracking, keep a record of that, get it into the person's health record. I mean, it's a complex piece of work. And the federal government pretty much just says every state's on their own. Well, that does not work. I mean, it's like Articles of Confederation. So regional groups have partnered together. It's still working as well as I'd like, not as well. But what's really interesting, I think your listeners would appreciate if they could, be a fly on the wall to listen to this. Not the same fly, a different fly that would land on the wall and listen to us talk. Republican governors of Indiana, Ohio, Democratic governors of, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, you wouldn't tell the difference because all of our issues are the same. The political pressures are slightly different, but even like those Republican governors in Republican-led legislative districts, they're getting pushback, on mask mandates, or the Supreme Court in the case of Michigan and Wisconsin overturning their roles. So we're still working. We're still trying. It's more informal than it is formal, but we trade ideas, we trade plans. We shared our school opening plan that I think is being replicated in several states, and that's the way it should work.
I'd love to double back for a moment and ask you a question about your master's degree, which has come up a couple of times during our conversation. And I would love if you could expand on why you decided to pursue the course of studies in genocide studies, maybe how that informs your public service, especially as somebody like you described your upbringing came from a pretty rural and maybe sheltered place to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment there, that not seeing a lot of diversity. It was basically Lutherans and Catholics. Everyone was white, some indigenous students, but in back in the 70s and when I'm in school, still very segregated. I think it started with my father. This is such a strange story. In the summer of 1973, there was an occupation at Wounded Knee. And the American Indian movement overtook the area up at Wounded Knee, and there were 2 federal agents that were killed, FBI agents. My community where I lived was, 30, 40 miles away, and we had curfews, and the men in town formed like posses and were armed on top of the buildings at night. And it was a surreal thing. I was a 4th grader watching this. Well, my father was the superintendent of schools. And I remember, we're not a very big house. We're being sent to our room when the adults would come. And there was a lot of loud voices and things like that. After this was all over, things would start, little dream catchers and different little foods would show up on our doorstep. And then my family moved shortly after this. Well, it turned out that my father held the line and said the Native kids would continue to go to school. And the community wanted them out because it was a risk. And I did not know that until I got a little older. My father died when I was relatively young. And I think it got me thinking about that commitment. And I didn't, like so many others, I did not have Jewish friends. And I learned about the Holocaust in school, and it seems so impersonal of how this could happen. And I think I got interested that way and got the opportunity. I lived in Southeast Asia for some times, and I spent time in Cambodia, and that wasn't that many years after the Khmer Rouge. And the question I'm asking is, so this happened. It happened again, time and time again. Our students have no idea, and they don't believe. Again, I kept asking before I did that unit and before I went to the Holocaust Museum. I asked them if they ever thought this could happen again, and they said, "Oh, no way, we're too modern for that." It didn't strike them as that Germany was the most technologically advanced nation on earth at the time, and it still happened. And so I think it was just that. And then I credit the incredible foresight of the folks at the Holocaust Museum of how they thought about the pedagogy of teaching this to high school. My God, I worked with teachers who did the yellow star thing, and you have to eat lunch last. And I'm like, kids would be saying, well, it doesn't seem to be so bad to be Jewish. You just have to eat lunch last. What were we teaching these kids? My God, with of the horror of this and understanding how you could teach this to eighth graders in a way that became much more personal. And I think you saw it, just the simple execution of stepping into that museum and getting given a card with a real person and the story before you ever step foot. And I'll have to tell you, it was so powerful because this was before it opened to the public. They had us there. And we went in, it was in an evening, 50 teachers, and it's a big deal. I'm a young teacher and I'm at this incredible museum we heard about, and I'm standing there in front of the mural at Auschwitz, and I mentioned something, and there was a gentleman standing next to me, and he said, "What do you think?" I said, "I can't imagine." And he walked up and pointed, and it was him. And he said, "That's the last time I saw my mother." They sent survivors with us to spend the time. So your question, Sarah, earlier is the one that haunts me. There aren't many of them left. So when you hear the statistics that 40% of Americans don't believe this was a real situation, not only do they not believe it's real, they're not thinking about the things that, what can we do to prevent this from ever happening again? That's the remembrance of never again was never put into our curriculum. It was never meant to be there. It was meant to be a factual place of being able to state a date, a time, some numbers, not to understand the human nature of it. So that whole thing, you've all get this well, but I had my students, it seemed a little deep for them as high school students, but they'd read Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil, and that would be the closing chapter in those units, and they would recognize, and it's very hard to recognize that it may be you and your neighbor who would do this, but that's what happens in society.
So sort of a hard pivot, but I guess related to all those concerns is we're sort of learning about history and also watching history happen right now. I don't want to let you off without asking you about the election. There's a lot of expectation around the election, a lot of unknowns. Biden is currently leading to be president of the United States, but that's not a given either. And what I want to ask you is sort of, in a time where it seems even more clear that a lot of people sort of are unsure what might happen in the next couple of months, you as governor, what's your, if Biden does win, what's your expectation of how, we should expect to see things change across the country with COVID response, with all of the issues that have been identified over the past couple months?
Yeah, and I do believe Joe Biden will win. I'll believe because I think there's a basic decency that's gone into that campaign. And I think one of the critiques was made about me is that I'm too willing to work across the aisle with folks. I'll own that. But I'm not willing to compromise my values. And I'm certainly not willing to work across the aisle when those policies are absolutely in conflict with what we stand for. And I think the vast majority of Americans probably feel that way. I have to tell you, having a federal partner would change everything. It's something to watch and we knew early on, I think, as governors that we weren't going to get a whole lot of help. And then if things went bad, we would get blamed for them. And what it did was imagine 6 months ago, if wearing a mask, even though every health agency said it reduces the spread to your neighbors, had become such a politically charged statement. It's like wearing, the donkey or the elephant or the red hat or whatever it might be. I hope that goes away because I said differences are fair. If my Republican friends in the Senate here in Minnesota wanted to talk tax policy, regulatory policy, environmental policy, those are all fine. But public health policy, this is science, it's fact. And I certainly get no joy out of asking people to do this, but it's my responsibility to keep them safe. And I think a Biden presidency ratchets that down. I think there will be more centralized coordination, which would help. I don't think we'd see those cross-border issues where one state has it, one doesn't when it comes to a public health issue. And I think the biggest thing is that would slow the spread. We have proof of this. Other countries have done this. Other countries have stopped the spread. Other countries, Canada has less infections than the White House. New Zealand, has less than the West Wing. You can do those types of things. And that is not me being facetious or anything. Those are factual situations because they made a conscious choice. The virus is a tough one, but it's relatively predictable how it'll spread based on our response. And if you go out and you don't wear a mask, you get in a crowded area and you yell and you get next to each other, people are going to get sick. Yeah, there's a 90% chance you're not going to get too sick and die, but it's that percentage that does. 220,000 avoidable deaths. That's just not acceptable. I think a Biden presidency changes that.
All right, I know we're running out of time, so we're gonna one last super light question to get out of here on. Did you know that your enjoyment of the Indigo Girls would give you so much common ground with a lot of the people I worked at Jewish summer camp with?
No, but I'm not even ashamed of this. I own it. I am a huge Indigo Girls fan. And just for all of you on here want to get super jealous, I saw them at Red Rocks in June, a summer concert at Red Rocks, beautiful Colorado sky. You tell me hearing Swampophilia out there is not one of the greatest things. So I'm owning it. I am an Indigo Girls. I'm all the way.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.